So you're back for a little reading of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, are you? Well, good, because that's what I'm going to do right now. How are you? I'm feeling a little tired myself today. Um, didn't know how that would come off on camera, but I thought, what the heck? We've been hanging out this long. I keep it real. So I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, a little bit tired. Had a lot going on today, but I still want to read, and I hope you do as well. So let's just get into it without further ado. The chapter we're picking up on is called A Favor for Jeremy. So let's see how Jeremy the Crow factors back into Mrs. Frisby's challenging situation for her and her family. In her worry about moving day, in watching the tractor, the cat, and finally the rats, Mrs. Frisby had forgotten that she had set out originally to get some corn for supper. Now she remembered it, so instead of continuing to her house, she turned toward the far corner of the garden and the stump at the edge of the woods beyond. She was a little tired after her dash from the cat, so she walked along slowly, feeling the warmth of the sun and the smell of the breeze. This mild breeze, carrying the moist essence of early spring, caused a dead leaf to flutter here and there, and across the garden near the fence it moved something that sparkled in the sunlight. This caught the corner of Mrs. Frisby's eye. She glanced at it, saw that it was only a bit of tinfoil, or aluminum foil, blown from somewhere, and she looked away again. Then she looked back, for at that moment a black object plummeted from the sky, and she recognized her friend Jeremy the Crow. A thought had crossed Mrs. Frisby's mind. She changed direction again, and moving more quickly, she ran across the earth to where Jeremy stood. He was hopping around the shiny piece of foil, eyeing it from one direction and another. What had occurred to Mrs. Frisby was that although Jeremy was not the brightest of animals she had met, and though he was young, he knew things and places she did not, and one had to begin somewhere. As she approached him, he had picked up the foil in his beak and was spreading his wings to fly off. "Wait, please," she called. He turned, folded his wings, and then replaced the foil carefully on the ground. "Hello," he said. "You remember me?" "Of course. You saved me from the cat." Then he added, "What do you think of this piece of foil?" Mrs. Frisby looked at it with much interest. "It's just a piece of foil," she said. "It's not very big." "True, but it's shiny, especially when the sun strikes it just so." "Why are you so interested in shiny things?" "Well, really, I'm not. At least, not very. But I have a friend who likes them. So when I see one, I pick it up." "I see. That's very thoughtful. And would the friend be female?" "As a matter of fact, yes. She is. How did you know?" "Just a guess," said Mrs. Frisby. "Do you remember saying once that if I needed help I might ask you?" "I do. Any time. Just ask for Jeremy. Any of the crows can find me. And now, if you will excuse me—" He bent over to pick up the foil again. "Please don't go yet," said Mrs. Frisby. "I think perhaps you can help me now." "Ah," said Jeremy. "What kind of help? Are you hungry? I'll bring you some seeds from the barn loft. I know where they're stored." And this is, by the way, Jeremy talking with Mrs. Frisby during this time. "No, thank you," said Mrs. Frisby. "We have enough to eat." And then she told him, as briefly as she could, about Timothy, his sickness, and the problem of moving day. Jeremy knew about moving day. Crows do not have to move, but they keep a close watch on such activities as plowing and planting so as to get their fair share of what's planted, and with their sharp eyes they see the small animals leaving before the plow. So he chuckled sympathetically when he heard Mrs. Frisby's story, cocked his head to one side, and thought as hard as he could, for as long as he could, which was about 30 seconds. His eyes closed with an effort. "I don't know what you should do," he said finally. "I'm sorry,
but maybe I can help even so. Wait, let me do it again. I'm sorry, but maybe I can help even so. At least, I can tell you what we do when we don't know what to do. We? The crows. Most of the birds.
What do you do then?
Over that way. Jeremy nodded in the direction of the deep woods and far-away mountains that rose beyond the fence. About a mile from here, there grows a very large beech tree, the biggest tree in the whole forest. Near the top of the tree, there is a hollow in the trunk. In the hollow lives an owl, who is the oldest animal in the woods, some say in the world. When we don't know what to do, we ask him. Sometimes he answers our questions, sometimes he doesn't. It depends on how he feels, or as my father used to say, what kind of a humor he's in.
Or possibly, thought Mrs. Frisbee, on whether or not he knows the answer. But she said, "Could you ask him, then, if he knows of any help for me?" She did not think it likely that he would.
Ah, no, Jeremy said. That won't do. That is, I could ask him, but I don't think the owl would listen. Imagine, a crow come to ask for help for a lady mouse with a sick child. He wouldn't believe me.
Then what's to be done?
What's to be done? You must go yourself and ask him.
But I could never find the tree, and if I did, I don't think I could climb so high.
Ah, now, that is where I can help, as I said I would. I would carry you there on my back, the way I did before. And home again, of course.
Mrs. Frisbee hesitated.
It was one thing to leap on a crow's back when the cat is only 3 jumps away and coming fast, but quite another to do it deliberately and to fly deep into a dark and unknown forest. In short, Mrs. Frisbee was afraid. Would you be afraid if you were Mrs. Frisbee?
Discuss,
Network. Then she thought of Timothy and of the big steel plow blade. She told herself, I have no choice. If there is any chance that the owl might be able to help me, to advise me, I must go. She said to Jeremy,
Thank you very much. I will go and talk to the owl if you will take me. It's a great favor.
It's nothing, said Jeremy. You're welcome, but we can't go now.
Why not?
In the daytime, when the sun is out, the owl goes deep into the hollow and sleeps. Excuse me, let's do that again. In the daytime, when the sun is out, the owl goes deep into the hollow and sleeps. That is, they say he sleeps, but I don't believe it. How could anyone sleep so long? I think he sits in there, part of the time at least, and thinks. That's why he knows so much. But anyway, he won't speak in the daytime. Not to anyone. And at night he's out flying, and hunting.
I know, said Mrs. Frisbee, and that was another reason to be afraid.
The time to see him is just at dusk. Then, just at dusk. Then, when the light gets dim, he comes to the entrance of the hollow and watches while the dark comes in. That's the time to ask him questions.
I understand, said Mrs. Frisbee. Shall we go this evening?
At 5 o'clock, Jeremy said. I'll be at your house. He picked up the piece of foil in his bill, waved goodbye, and flew off. Well, short chapter. I feel like we're on a roll here, folks. Why don't I give you the next one? Let's see what happens. Let's continue on to the next chapter, The Owl. I believe chapter 7. Jeremy appeared as promised when the last thumbnail of sun winked out over the mountains beyond the meadow. Mrs. Frisbee was waiting, her heart pounding in her ears, and 3 of the children were there to watch. Teresa and Martin standing beside their mother, and Cynthia, who was afraid of the crow, just a pair of round eyes peering out the round doorway. Timothy was down below, taking a nap, and had not been told about the expedition, lest he worry and blame himself for the risk his mother must take. Indeed, the words moving day had not been mentioned in his presence. Even to the other children, Mrs. Frisbee had explained only part of the problem. That is, she had not told them that there would be that there were only 5 days left, nor anything about Mr. Fitzgibbon and the tractor. She did not want them to worry either. Jeremy landed with a swoosh, a bit dramatically, perhaps, and nodded at the children and Mrs. Frisbee. "Hello," he said. "Here I am." Mrs. Frisbee introduced Martin and Teresa, and Cynthia's eyes. Martin, who wished he were going on the trip himself, asked Jeremy in excitement, "How high can you fly?" "Oh, I don't know exactly," Jeremy said. "A couple of miles, I guess." "Mother, did you hear? You'll be up 2 miles up in the air." "Martin, it won't be necessary to go so high on this trip," Jeremy said cheerfully. "No, but I can, if you'd like." "No, thank you. I wouldn't think of your taking the trouble." She was trying hard to hide her terror, and Martin had not helped matters at all. But Jeremy suddenly saw that she was trembling and realized that she must be afraid. "It's all right," he said kindly. "There's nothing to be nervous about. I fly over the woods a dozen times a day." "Yes," thought Mrs. Frisbee, "but you're not riding on your back, and you can't fall off." That's what she's thinking. "All right," she said as bravely as she could. "I'm ready. Teresa and Martin, take care of Timothy until I come back, and be sure you don't tell him where I've gone." With a small leap, she was on Jeremy's back. Here's her getting up. Brave Mrs. Frisbee. For the love of her children, of her family, she's going to do something that no mouse probably has ever done or would ever think to do, unless they were desperate. Oh, and then you can see there's Cynthia's eyes poking out. Love that. With a small leap, she was on Jeremy's back, lying as flat as she could and holding tight to the glossy feathers between his wings, as a horseback rider grips the horse's mane before a jump. Martin and Teresa waved goodbye, but she did not see them, for she had her face pressed against the feathers and her eyes closed. Once again she felt the surge of power as the crow's broad wings beat down against the air. This time it lasted longer, for they were going higher than before. Then the beating became gentler as they leveled off, and then, to her alarm, it stopped altogether. What was wrong? The crow must have felt her grow tense, for suddenly from ahead she heard his voice. "An updraft," he said. "We're soaring." "There's usually one over this stretch of woods in the evening." A current of warm air rising from the woods was carrying them along. So smooth was the motion that they seemed to stand still, and Mrs. Frisbee ventured to open her eyes and lift her head just a trifle. She could not look straight down. That was Jeremy's back, but off to the right, and a bit behind them, she saw a gray-brown square the size of a postage stamp. She realized with a gasp that it was the garden patch, and Martin and Teresa, if they were still there, were too small to be seen. "Look to the left," said Jeremy, who was watching over his shoulder. She did, and saw what looked like a wide, fearsome snake, blue-green in color, coiling through the woods. "What do you think it is?" "What is it?" she asked in wonder. "You really don't know? It's the river." "Oh," said Mrs. Frisbee, rather ashamed of her ignorance. She had heard of the river, of course, but had not known that it looked like a snake. She had never been there, since to reach it one had to cross the entire width of the forest. There were advantages to being a bird. In a minute more they had left the updraft, and Jeremy's wings resumed pumping. They went higher, and Mrs. Frisbee closed her eyes again. When she opened them, the garden patch had vanished far behind them, and Jeremy, searching the trees below, began a long, slanting descent. Eventually, as he banked sharply, Mrs. Frisbee saw off his wingtip a gray-brown patch among a stand of tall green trees. From so high it looked like a gnarled gray bush, but as they circled lower she could see that it was in fact an enormous tree, leafless, skeletal, and partly dead. One huge branch had recently broken off and fallen, and 3 pine trunks lay bent double under its weight. It was a gloomy and primeval spot, deeply shadowed in the gray dusk. Jeremy circled over it one more time, looking at a certain mark 3/4 of the way up the towering main trunk. Just below this spot, and another great branch, itself as big as an ordinary tree, jutted out over the tops of the pines, and on this, at last, Jeremy fluttered gently to rest. They were some 10 feet from the main trunk, and Mrs. Frisbee could see, just above the place where the branch joined the tree, a dark round hole, as large as a lunch plate. "We're here," Jeremy said in a low voice. "There's where he lives." "Should I get down?" Instinctively, Mrs. Frisbee spoke in a whisper. "Yes, we've got to walk closer, but quietly. He doesn't like loud noises." "It's so high." She still clung to the crow's back. "But the limb is broad. You'll walk safe enough." And indeed, the limb was almost as wide as a sidewalk. Mrs. Frisbee gathered her courage, slithered down, and felt the solid wood under her feet. Still, she could not help thinking about how far it was to the ground below. "There he is," said Jeremy, staring at the hole. "It's just the right time." They inched their way along the limb, Mrs. Frisbee gripping the rough bark tightly, being careful not to stumble. And as they came closer, she could dimly perceive a shape like a squat vase sitting back in the hollow of the tree. Near the top of the vase, wide apart, 2 round yellow eyes glowed in the dark. "He can't see us," Jeremy whispered. "It's still too light." Perhaps not, but he could hear, for a deep, round voice, a voice like an organ tone, echoed out of the hollow trunk. "Who is standing outside my house?" Pretty good, right? Jeremy answered, "Sir, I am a crow. My name is Jeremy, and I've brought a friend. I hope we have not disturbed you. My friend needs your advice." "I see. And can your friend not speak for himself?" "Sir, my friend is a lady mouse." "A mouse?" The sonorous voice sounded unbelieving. "Why should a crow be a friend to a mouse?" "I was trapped, sir, and she set me free. She saved me from the cat." "That is possible," said the owl, "though unusual. I have heard of such a thing before. We all help one another against the cat." "True, and now, sir, my friend herself is in trouble." "I understand," said the owl, moving closer to the round entrance of his hollow. "Mrs. Mouse, I cannot see you, for the glare of the daylight is too bright. But if you will step inside my house, I will listen to what you have to say." Mrs. Frisbee hesitated. She knew something of the dietary habits of owls, and she did not much like the idea of being trapped in his house. Finally, she said timidly, "Sir, I would not want to intrude, and I can hear you quite well from out here." "Mrs. Mouse, please understand that I have no interest at all, as a general rule, in helping mice to solve their problems. If you have indeed saved a bird from the cat, I will spare you a few minutes. But I do not discuss problems with people I cannot see. Either come inside, or tell your friend to take you home again." Behind her, Mrs. Frisbee heard Jeremy whisper, very softly, "It's all right. He wouldn't harm you in his own home." She whispered back, "I hope not." She walked up the limb to the hollow, climbed over the sill, and stepped inside. Can you imagine, for a mouse, this is your arch nemesis. This is the thing in the dark that takes your family, that like attacks you, eats you. So, yeah, imagine the most terrifying, visceral enemy you could possibly encounter in an enclosed space. but you have no choice but to encounter that person, beast, whatever it is, because you need their help. Very scary, very brave, Mrs. Frisby in her animal world, right? Up so close, the owl looked very large. Each of his feathery feet was tipped with 5 gleaming talons, an inch long. His beak was curved and sharp and cruel. He blinked his yellow eyes and said, "Please, step across the room, away from the light." Miss Frisby did as she was told. As she grew accustomed to the dimness, she looked around her. The chamber into which she had stepped was spacious. At that level, almost half of the large trunk was hollow, and clean. But the floor was extremely rough. It was not really a floor at all, but only the jagged ends of dead wood sticking up from below, like stalagmites in a cave, so that Mrs. Frisby had to climb rather than walk as she crossed the room. In the back, the walls narrowed to a corner, and there she saw that the owl had built himself a nest, as big as a water bucket, of twigs and leaves. From the top she could see protruding some wisps of the feathers from which he had lined it. When she got near this nest, she stopped and faced the owl, who had turned from the light of the doorway and was peering at her with his great yellow eyes. Jeremy was nowhere to be seen. She could only hope he was still waiting on the limb outside. "Now," said the owl, "you may state your problem." And that's the end of the chapter. Well, cliffhanger. So we'll see how that goes with Mrs. Frisby and the great owl in this epic encounter. And thanks for sticking with me. Love hearing what you think. Your comments, your support is always welcome. And we will see you on the next one. Go to the Rats. We'll hear about that when we tune in next time. Thanks.